Well, good evening and welcome to the proceedings of the Grand Rapids Public Schools Board of Education. This evening is Monday, February 8th, and it is our work session. So let's begin with a roll call. Secretary Lewis, will you please call the roll?
Dr. Flores?
Present.
I guess that took yes. Ms. Grant?
Yes, present.
Ms. Lewis is here. Reverend Matthias?
Here.
Mr. Ross is coming. Mrs. Williams?
Present.
Dr. Baker?
Here.
Oh, Mr. Ross, you're here now?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay. Ms. Davis?
Here.
President Chucky?
Present.
We have a quorum.
Thank you, Ms. Lewis. May I have a motion for approval of the agenda this evening?
Motion to approve the agenda. Support.
All right, thank you. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed, same sign. Great, motion carries. Well, this evening we have two special orders of business. We are going to work through our working draft of the equity policy, and we're also going to review the strategic planning RFP so that we can vote to finalize that and release it tomorrow for responses. So this evening we'll begin with the equity policy work. I want to thank Ms. Davis as the chair of the policy committee last year. It is under her leadership that the policy committee was able to really bring forward what I believe is a strong working document for us to finalize as a board this evening. The ultimate goal of this work is to prepare this to move forward for a first reading at an upcoming board meeting. But we all really believe strongly that this equity policy is the work of the full board, and we all must be in agreement and in alignment with what we are saying and doing as a result of the policy work. I was reflecting on this last night, actually, as I was filling out a questionnaire for Brooklyn, my daughter, for her well child checkup today. And there were a series of true and false questions on this questionnaire of things like, does she eat 5 servings of fruits and vegetables? And does she eat breakfast every day? And does she have a television in her room? And at the end of the questionnaire, there were 2 questions on a scale of 1 to 10. And it was on a scale of 1 to 10, how ready are you to make changes? And on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you that you can make those changes? So today, as we walk through this policy, I'm asking each of you to reflect on those 2 questions. How ready are we, as this Board of Education, to make these changes? And how confident are we that we can make these changes? Because we must be ready and confident as we vote in this work. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and we'll start to walk through the document. This truly is a workshop. This is a draft. It's really, I think, close to where we want it to be, but we want the input of every single board member on each of these bullet points so that we can bring forward a document that we are all ready to put into action. All right, so bear with me here as I share my screen. Okay, so everybody's seeing the draft board equity policy. Great.
Ms. Shockey, do you mind making it just a little bit larger?
Happy to. Is that better? Great. All right, so the first part of the equity policy document is the equity statement that we've already worked on together. That statement is, the Grand Rapids Board of Education recognizes and celebrates the diversity of our student population, and thus we commit to ensuring all students receive an inclusive and equitable educational experience. The Board of Education will remove barriers for students by providing access, opportunities, and resources. Furthermore, the board will create and monitor the implementation of policies that will ensure equitable outcomes in the following areas, including, but not limited to, budget, curriculum, human resources, professional learning, and extracurricular activities. Again, this is the work that we did at the last work session, so this is in pretty good shape, but are there any comments as you hear it again this evening regarding the opening statement?
President Shockey,
Yes.
I think that this is not the one that, I mean, word-wise, it's fine, but there were a couple of little things that I did as far as grammar and stuff, and they do not appear to be in this particular one, okay? So it's just the word thus is parenthetical, so it should have commas around it. And then after including, comma, but not limited to, comma, and you've got those in there. So that we talked about that before, but
Okay.
okay, this just obviously is the copy that didn't get corrected.
Okay. Ms. Pitts, as you see this, do you have a different copy? Perhaps I pulled up an incorrect version.
Let me see. Let me look and see the version that I have up.
Okay, great. I'm fairly certain this is the one that
Everything's the same except the commas.
Okay,
Yeah, what you have is what I have, Ms. Shaki.
okay,
We
all right.
I don't know
changed
what
it,
happened to
said-
the,
Yeah, you probably just didn't make it to the final one, but
Okay,
but that's something we can do after the meeting. It's no big deal.
very good.
Okay.
All right. So I think the process will be just to walk these through bullet by bullet. And those of us that serve on the policy committee, we're happy to discuss how we got to these bullets, if there's questions. And then, of course, we're very open to dialogue about each and every one of them to make them better. So let's start with the first one. The district shall review practices, procedures, and programs to assure that discriminatory practices do not influence outcomes. The district shall use all available data disaggregated by race, ethnicity, language, ability, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, socioeconomic background, and mobility to inform all district decision-making. All right, number one, any feedback or discussion on this bullet?
Sorry, Ms. Shakti,
Yes,
can we just go back to our statement
sure.
and just wanting clarification when we say the Board of Education will remove barriers for students. What are we stating in that?
President Shockey, if I may.
Please.
Okay. I think like one of the barriers that I know that we have just eliminated was the barrier for kids to get into our choice schools like the not museum, but zoo or Blandford. And it was, that they had to have test in both of the ones, math and language, and we've changed it now, is my understanding, right, Dr. Roby? So that they just have to have the score in one or the other? Is that right?
Yes, but I think, and Reverend Matthias, please kind of elaborate and expound upon that, because I think you're going is, what are you saying by the board is going to remove barriers? Is it more in theory or in practice? Because and we're getting into kind of semantics, but I think he was kind of staying on the perch of what does that actually mean by that sentence?
Yeah, I was alluding to that because after that we say by providing access, opportunities, and resources. And then we kind of define that later on by saying not limited to the budget, curriculum, human resources, professional learning, extracurricular activities. I'm assuming in that we have an understanding that there are barriers that our students come with, whether it's historical barriers, whether it's economic, whether all of those kinds of things. And we are fully aware as a board to those, and then therefore we are working on those things that impede on their ability to succeed under our care, if I'm not out of line there. And so just wanting to elaborate on that. What is our understanding of removing barriers? And
If I'm hearing you correctly, I think that through this equity policy and further down in bullet points, because of all of the regular gathering of feedback and monitoring of data, we're going to be more aware of potential barriers so that we can move as a board forward in a way that will remove those. Does that make sense?
mhm.
I also, yeah, I think that it looks like, John, it looks like your questions are answered below, but I thought you were asking a different question, which is what will the board do rather than what will other people do? And my sense is that what the board is doing is creating this the set of expectations that's written in this policy, and we're directing the superintendent to get the district to do that, which means that essentially we would be evaluating the superintendent by her ability to do this work. Is that correct?
Yes. And so remember, you want to stay on the perch or kind of at that 20,000 foot level versus what it's not a direct action of what you're doing, but kind of setting the stage of the expectations.
Yeah, and I think that when I read it again just a few minutes ago before John's comment, I looked at that sentence too, and I said, in my mind, I asked what barriers, but then the rest of the sentence and what follows is more specific, and I think answers those in a natural sense. So it doesn't matter what barrier is presented. It's we're going to remove these barriers, whatever barrier is inherent and obvious, and we're going to provide access and opportunities and resources so that those barriers do disappear or are mitigated.
I think it's important that we acknowledge that we understand there are barriers, and that's part of why it's included there. Not that we can necessarily identify every one of them as they stand today, but rather we understand that there are systemic and institutional barriers that can contribute to inequities.
Very well stated.
Correct. And also other kinds of barriers that perhaps, as Dr. Flores alluded, are either inherent or come to the surface of. And so as a board, we are looking for that. I appreciate the 20,000 foot perspective, but we also are responsible for the ground level of what's produced in essence under our watch or under our boardship. Once our superintendent proposes to carry those out and brings it to the board for ratifying or those kinds of things. So it's a both and. It's not sticking our fingers in everything, but it is an understanding that we have to know and then be able to work together in those.
All right, Reverend Matthias, if you're comfortable, may we go through some of the additional bullets? And then if you think if we need to come back to the statement and expand it all on barriers, we can, but I think maybe we'll cover some of those details in the bullets below.
Sure.
Okay, great. All right, so back to that first bullet, is there any further discussion on that one, or does that feel inclusive of primarily, I think it's the disaggregated information, which data we hope to gather and evaluate?
This is Mrs. Williams, and I just have a question with regards to the indicators that we are going to use or kind of will be the scorecard for progress. I don't see where we've addressed that. And it seems like in this first part, we talk about it, reviewing the practices and procedures, but I don't see what measuring stick we have laid down.
It's my assumption, and I could be totally off, but that it will be up to administration to come up with some sort of way to prove things to us. And also, our last bullet point, I believe, will address that to some extent, because that's more work for us to do as a board when we get to, I can't scroll down because it's Jen sharing a screen, but the last bullet point. Yeah. So
Yeah, I think, to quote Ms. Pitts, if I get this right, it's the policy is the what, and then the superintendent and the district have to figure out the how. So they will figure out how to measure this data, understanding that this is the data we want to use to evaluate that we do not have discriminatory outcomes. And so they will come to us then with those specifics.
I guess I have a couple of comments under that, just under it, where we say the district shall review practices, and it'll be forthcoming, but what practices, and certainly what procedures, and then of course what programs. One of the words that I had a question about was discriminatory. What about if we use the word biased? What's the difference in using that word versus discriminatory, and what do we mean by discriminatory?
These are good questions. We didn't discuss how we're defining discriminatory at the policy committee meeting. I guess I'll open it up for discussion. Any preference over bias versus discriminatory?
I think biased might be a better word for the sentence, because it can, discriminatory, I think, is viewed as more intentional, even though I don't think it really necessarily is, but bias, I think, is understood as things that can happen intentionally or unintentionally. And I think it flows well to assure that bias practices do not influence outcomes.
I like discriminatory because I do believe that with discrimination there, it can be as well unintended as well as a bias. And the outcome of either can be what is, called discrimination. And so I think that coining it as such is what the end is. The bias is what leads to, it's a symptom of, but that it does not address the actual outcome, which is the result of discrimination. So I personally like that language, but I also think that it's beyond just a matter of discrimination too, because you can do things in an inequitable fashion that may not necessarily be discriminatory. And so if this is an equity-based policy, I think we need to speak to the language of equity as well.
Yeah, when I think of,
I'd like to support that conclusion too. I think discriminatory and biased practices, or bias practices are in fact distinct.
I think that works. I'm watching the bottom of our screens now and seeing the closed captioning that is happening. Shows that prior to this, we were probably operating in a biased fashion, and that we were not providing as accessible language as we could have, but now we are. But so it's clearly biased because we didn't know. I guess to use Kim's things in a way, it's certainly discriminating, but it does have a different connotation, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right on point. I think that's a good example. We were biased and it resulted in discriminatory practices. So I think, like Dr. Flores, maybe we would, like he offered, maybe it would be programs to ensure that bias or discriminatory practices do not influence outcomes. So just adding bias to it, I think would be appropriate.
First. So biased.
That bias or discriminatory practices do not.
When I read it, I didn't necessarily want us to start off on the negative in terms of discriminatory or the assumption is that everything or most everything that's done or comes out of the public school perhaps are discriminatory, are intended to hold down or bring less to our student body or staff and so forth. And so that's why as I looked at that word and thought, what other word either would replace it or would define it better for us as we're intending to develop a policy that that really helps us look at our outcomes and then tweak it or adjust it as we discover, learn, grow, and so forth.
I can appreciate that tone. So I think we could flip it to say the district shall review practices, procedures, and programs to assure that they are unbiased and non-discriminatory, rather than assuming that we will find biases and discrimination. I don't know.
I like
It's
that.
nuanced.
Yeah.
Okay. That's like that. Good.
Mhm.
Okay. Any further discussion on that one? All right, let's move on. Next bullet, the district shall regularly gather feedback from students, families, and staff in order to create and nurture an inclusive, accepting, and belonging environment.
Well, I had other comments under our first one.
Oh, sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. So on our so as we go into describing by race, ethnicity, language, ability, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, we've expanded now our understanding of how we see gender identity expression. Before it was much narrower, if I'm not mistaken, correct? And now we're including that, right?
That's correct.
That.
Yes.
Right.
No,
Oh,
no.
thank you,
no.
Ms. Fitz.
Our policy, our discrimination policy includes all of those things. So this has been your policy for several years. So we just were including what we already included in our policy.
And including it does what?
I'm sorry?
And including it does what? So
I'm sorry, I don't understand your question.
So desegregating it point by point does what?
It helps us be aware of all of the ways in which we can have bias and discriminatory outcomes. So it's a lens, just a lens against which we would be evaluating these things to make sure that we're not missing someone. And a lot of times, if you're not conscious about it or consciously call it out, your biases could help you not pay attention to it. So I think that was the rationale for the committee, but obviously committee members can speak too.
Okay.
But that's like the closed captioning that we now have. Ability was put in that, so someone recognized that we may not be we may be biased against the hearing impaired, so therefore we need to look at this and then do it.
And
And
again,
with that in mind, could we also say that ability applies to the category of special needs? Am I correct there or no?
Yeah,
A bit, it is all encompassing of all of that, which is
Of
why
all
we
of that.
went for the more
Okay.
general as opposed to the specific.
Thank you for the clarity.
because in this policy, then we are going to attach that to our learning, to our education, sex ed, I mean, you name it, right? How we do sex education, how we teach our kids about gender identity, expression, sexual orientation is now filtering, and it has been, right? But it's filtering into the education of our kids in the choices that are out there, or the expressions that are out there.
What this is saying, Sharon, is that we are determining that our practices, procedures, and programs we seek to make them unbiased and non-discriminatory. The curriculum that's taught are decided also by other entities. So there is a sexual education committee that's required by the state that includes community members and district employees to determine what that is. And that's what determines what is taught in sex education. And then when in teaching that curriculum, this policy says that when we teach that curriculum, we would not do it in a way that is biased or discriminatory. Is that a correct way to see that, Sharon?
Yes, and even what would happen is as we're on those committees, having this lens, if we saw things that we thought were biased or discriminatory, we would be raising them then and trying to, have an influence at that level too. So at all levels, because that would, as part of our practices of being members of committees, we would be speaking up on that. And we tend to have, influence on policies and decisions, or at least can help to impact them. And then you're right, Dr. Baker, when we actually teach the courses, it would be through that lens too. Yes.
Matthias, does that answer your question there?
Yeah, I just want to make sure that that's what I'm hearing in these statements, that as the state mandates, and again, is it the choice of the school to do that, or is it a mandate that has to be taught?
Well, everything, obviously, this whole thing is circled around or encompassed by what we have control over, right? So there's some things that we don't have control over, we may not like, we may not agree with, but because they're the law, we have to comply with. But to the extent that we have practices and procedures and programs that we actually have control over, this would be our guiding principles.
For this particular bullet, though, in this section of the bullet, we're really just talking about how the data will be used. We're really not talking about any decisions on what we're going to do as far as programming. We're just simply saying that, at least the way I read it, is that we're going to use all available data across these categories to help inform our decision making. Not that any decisions may not. I guess that's just the way I'm reading. So I guess I'm maybe confused by the discussion, maybe, to be honest.
What's the confusion?
Because this particular bullet is really not talking about what we're going to do, other than that use available data across these categories to inform decision making. It doesn't say that we're going to teach anything in particular. It simply says that whatever we teach is going to be data informed, and it's going to be Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
I agree with that.
yeah. So that's
Whatever
what I
we
was
teach is going to be important.
Okay,
Yeah.
any other suggested edits or discussion on this one? Okay. Going to move us on to the next one then. Again, the district shall regularly gather feedback from students, families, and staff in order to create and nurture an inclusive, accepting, and belonging environment. Any discussion on this one?
And I would just want to make sure that that the board gets the feedback information, that we actually get aggregated discussion about the issues that our families would be concerned about. Obviously, we're assuming that we would, um, that our district would be consistently looking at feedback from all these entities in order to get a measure of how things are going or where it's going if things are being improved.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a, a place that this would come up frequently would be in the superintendent evaluation. You know, one of the many bullets is, you know, how do you gather feedback? And, you know, how do you listen to your community? These are all, there's various characteristics that touch on this. So as we ask the superintendent to give us the evidence, this would be a great example of evidence that she could provide would be however she has listened, whether it's listening sessions or surveys or town halls, whatever that might be. But again, the how will be up to Dr. Ruby and her team. Okay, may I move on to the next one? Great. The district shall differentiate resource allocation to ensure equitable access to efficacious staff and high quality curriculum, facilities, and support services. Dialogue about this one.
So this is saying pretty clearly that some people might need more resources than others, and that we'll distribute them that way, correct?
Yes. And just because something is working well doesn't mean that it's the thing that needs the most resource allocation. Yes. Any edits or suggestions for this one? Dr. Baker, I'm looking at you.
Oh, I'm good. I
Okay.
like this one.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. I appreciated your sigh. It does come with a sigh.
Oh.
All right. If there's no discussion on that one,
I like that it's there. I guess that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Sometimes my sighs are about, you know, I don't know, looking out the window and seeing how. So
no, it was perfect. I think it was
please,
good.
please make sure you're clear on my size.
Yes. All right, moving on. The district shall identify and mitigate culturally biased instructional materials, assessments, and pedagogies to ensure equitable outcomes.
Yeah, don't know if I feel super strong about it, but my initial read, I didn't know if mitigate was strong enough, frankly. I mean, mitigate connotes sort of a reduction or sort of lessening the impact of something as opposed to, you know, removing. Mitigate sort of reduces it, but it doesn't necessarily, you know, really remove it. So that was just my comment there. I don't know if we want a stronger word or if my interpretation is inaccurate.
I think that's a good point. I think eliminate would be what we would want to do as far as the. No, I agree. Mitigate just means we'll try to make this better, but I think eliminate means more purposeful.
Yeah.
Are there any times where it's impossible to eliminate? I'm just thinking of, like, if I'm reading a book, if it's a required text or something, the way that a teacher presents it could be mitigating rather than removing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'd hate to get to where we're like banning books, because, you know, so could we do like what John was saying earlier with the other, the first bullet point was start with the district shall identify and implement culturally responsive instructional materials, and seek to eliminate bias. You know, I mean, if we got into a place where we're like, you know, I don't want to get into a debate about, I don't know.
Sawyer.
Yeah, Tom Sawyer, or you know, or you know, To Kill a Mockingbird or something like that. I think that they're important discussions to have, and you know, we don't want to be, the board should not be in the business of banning books, but it should be finding, but we have sought to eliminate textbooks that depicted slavery in inaccurate historical manners that was offensive. You know, so I think it is a tough sentence to have here. But if we looked at the positives, shall seek to identify and implement culturally responsive instructional materials, then that puts that, and I'm thinking of when we, first of all, I think it's really hard for the board because we don't really know everything. So the board just purchased, along with the district, new language ELA materials. And that the Academic Achievement Committee learned of the attempts to be culturally responsive. And we also learned that it was much more culturally responsive than the previous curriculum. But it costs $1 million. And 2 years from now, most of the people on that committee won't be on that committee anymore. And no one will know whether or not the ELA is culturally responsive or not. So, but if this is our policy, then when the Academic Achievement Committee has curriculum presented to it, it will know to ask, is it culturally responsive? And are there biases that we should try to eliminate? I don't know.
Dr. Baker, will you walk me through your language again just a little more slowly?
It's a suggestion first. I'm proposing that we either replace it or change it to include to identify and implement culturally responsive instructional materials, assessments, and pedagogies. Now that if we get rid of that sentence that you just got rid of, then that is different. And go to Reynard's point, you know, it doesn't necessarily advise us to get rid of culturally biased. So we have to decide whether or not this does it.
I like that, Dr. Baker. I like the way it puts a positive spin. My only wonder is if it is taking away any exploration or looking into current curriculum. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's why I'm somewhat afraid of getting rid of it.
I wonder if we could do both. The district shall seek to identify and implement culturally responsive instructional materials, assessments, and pedagogies, and seek to mitigate or eliminate those which are culturally biased.
I like that because, again, I don't want us to throw it out, but to actually have intelligent and certainly high-spirited discussions about why it was and why it's changed and why it ought to. And so I don't want us to just, hey, we're throwing that out because today it doesn't feel good.
So Jen,
we're working through.
So that
Thank
would
you.
go after pedagogies. What I'm proposing is after pedagogies, it would say, and seek to mitigate or eliminate those which are culturally biased to ensure equitable outcomes. Does that make sense?
Could I suggest the word modify somewhere in there? If, I mean, as one of the possibilities?
Mitigate or modify instead of eliminate.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, right. I mean, maybe something would be eliminated too, but I think that it could also be modified.
I like that too. And hopefully our teachers are already doing that.
Yeah.
You know?
Okay.
May I ask, what is the benefit of the seek to as opposed to
Yeah.
shall?
Right.
Good without it?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay, the district shall.
Would
this-
that go for the second part of that sentence too, instead of in pedagogies and shall?
And shall, thank you.
This, I feel comfortable with this because it still doesn't, this is what the district does. The district will identify and implement and shall mitigate, modify, or eliminate. And they'll be able to explain to the board how what they did that, but it doesn't put the board in the business of deciding what curriculum or books are appropriate.
Right.
So,
Great.
Okay.
Okay, good work. Scroll down a little. The district shall recruit, hire, and retain high-quality personnel that reflect student demographics at all organizational levels. No small task. Any feedback? Okay. Hearing none, I'm moving on. The district shall train and support. Yes, Christian.
I'm sorry, I actually do have
Yeah.
something. Could we also add grow there? Because we've been saying that that is a main focus of the district, to grow our own and implement programs. Would that be a place to also add that language?
Yeah, I'm trying to think exactly where to put it.
Do we
Just
say
Continually grow, would it
develop?
be,
Is it
yes,
recruit, hire, develop, and retain? Or
Yep, I think that could work.
yeah.
Mhm.
And also just because I think that's a key component of actually retaining people, is helping to develop them.
exactly.
good.
Does that also though, so we're developing those that we also have, but I think I heard you say, Ms. Grant, that we want to, I interpret it as just the pipeline. So we're implementing programs to grow our own.
That is initially what my intention was for, as we look at programs that are aiming to grow our own, especially teachers and things like that.
So maybe that should go before recruit.
But is that really a how and not a what?
That's a how, that's not a what. Because remember, it's
Oh.
the district shall recruit, hire, develop, and retain. Retain is bold in my mind, that once you get someone here, however you get them through a grow your own or whatever, it's keeping them through that continual professional development and growth opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm fine with leaving it as the develop piece.
I see it.
Good. Okay. Next one. The district shall train and support personnel at all organizational levels to engage in culturally responsive practices and delivery of service. The district shall ensure that staff participate in diversity and inclusion training and DEI courses.
What are DEI courses? And does that need to be spelled out?
I had the same thought about spelling it out, but I don't know what a DEI course
I think
is.
it's re-
Inclusion.
Diversity, equity, and
Inclusion.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Mhm.
So
Probably
is
need to be
it
spelled out? Yeah.
redundant? Or is diversity and inclusion training different from DEI courses?
Yeah, that is a bit redundant.
I think it's redundant. You could just use the latter.
Okay, so take this out and then spell out DEI. Is that good? So the district shall ensure that staff participate in, gotta move that, diversity, equity, and inclusion courses.
I'll advocate that we leave training in there because, you know, some of the in-service training is not necessarily a course in DEI. You know, where you might have just a seminar, you might have you know, a speaker on in a training session on diversity.
Does that cover it if I bring it back into the end of that sentence? So diversity, equity, and inclusion training and courses.
Sounds fine to me, Jen. Mhm.
Sure.
All right, anything else on that one? All right, next. The district shall incorporate the voice and perspectives of students, families, and communities served in decision-making.
I don't necessarily have issue with the bullet, but it seems very similar to the second bullet. We're regularly getting feedback for an accepting and belonging environment. Although, of course, the intention of the second bullet is for the inclusive and belonging environment. But I think that sort of flirts with the theme of this bullet as well. So don't know if
Could they be combined where
Yeah,
it,
that's what I was just thinking.
yeah, because I was thinking the same thing, that they're very similar, and because it's about how do we gather voice of people and then demonstrate that voice.
yeah, exactly.
I think that when we were in the committee, we were talking about that as being active voices in committees and task forces that might be created in every aspect of decision making in the district. That's not necessarily a feedback of perspective given to you in some forum. It's creating an active voice and participation in decision making from these various groups.
Maybe participation is maybe the key phrase there. Then, because that, this doesn't really indicate that, but I definitely get your point, though.
Right.
So maybe it's the district. Maybe it's something about participation, or maybe, yeah, I think maybe just including something about that in here might bring that home a bit. Maybe it's just district shall incorporate the voice and perspective of students, families, and communities serving in the district, but by soliciting participation or something to that effect to help with decision making. I don't know, something along those lines. But I think participation, if that's the theme, then we need to put that in here.
Could you just swap out perspectives for participation, because the voice really is the perspective.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's where everyone always says how smart you are.
I think that's great. Good. Okay. Next. The district shall adopt and review an annual budget that provides for the equitable allocation of finances across the district. Pretty straightforward there. Any comments? Okay, next. The district shall review its purchasing practices to eliminate barriers to participation and ensure that women and minority-owned businesses are included. Anything there? Okay.
Why single out women?
Only because there are specific designations as a WBE or an MBE, so a woman-owned business enterprise or a minority-owned business enterprise, I think was the rationale as to why.
Do we need to add the word equitably at the end instead of just included? I mean, they're included now, but I don't know that they're included equitably.
Point.
But then how do you divide that? What are you going to say? 1/3 of, as you know, to 1/4?
No,
I mean, what percentage do you
I
add?
didn't get into that, into the how. I think we just asked the question, are they included equitably?
So just equitably here.
Just put it in front of included.
Oh yeah, that could be too.
Now I know I'm going down a rabbit hole that I don't think will identify an appropriate word tonight, but I would argue that, frankly, the language of identifying folks as minority is inequitable just from the semantics of it. I mean, I do know, you know, in the world we live in, I know what we mean by that, but also the world we live in is discriminatory and equitable in general. And I definitely would argue that labeling any groups of folks as minority by definition of the word puts them in a subjugated sort of position. And again, for our policy purposes, I don't necessarily know if that's you know, something we want to try to peel back, but for the sake of our conversation and the spirit of what we're talking about, I just thought I'd mention it.
Would you
I
suggest,
echo that.
like, yeah, would you suggest businesses of, and I'm trying to, and we're getting into this kind of semantics, I'm just trying to think of what would be appropriate, diversity of business ownership, and this is not my strength as I say this, but I'm just trying to figure out kind of how to get to the spirit of what you're saying, that we're going to have equitable practices as we look at businesses, so that we are including the voices and opportunities for businesses that are not necessarily always considered.
Yeah, honestly, I don't know, and I don't know if we even need to try to tackle it tonight. I think you know, it may be something we would just chew on and maybe offering it later, because yeah, I'm definitely at a loss on how to say that succinctly. But I don't know. I don't have any real ideas or solution, unfortunately.
Maybe the word underrepresented.
I like that.
Underrepresented populations, right?
Or traditionally underrepresented, because then that gets to,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
wait, it all part of the soup. We're all just...
That's right.
And I think that's part of the, you know, the new language that most likely has to be developed, or even the mindset, as you were saying, Mr. Ross, where we tend to think of minority, but then that puts us in a disadvantaged state of mind and state. And so we have to reinterpret that differently. We're looking at differently. So.
All right, so what do you think? The district shall review its purchasing practices to eliminate barriers to participation and ensure that traditionally underrepresented businesses are equitably included. Better? Okay, great. Good discussion. All right. The district shall provide resources.
Can I just go back to
Yes,
that a
of
little
course.
bit, because it is a little bit of a semantics, because traditionally unrepresented businesses could be lots of different businesses but
Right.
that's not, so maybe if
Okay.
we say that, ensure that businesses maybe owned by, I think you want to get to that ownership piece.
Owned by, yeah.
Traditionally unrepresented, now what's the noun that goes with that?
Persons.
Persons, yeah, persons.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
I think that might get a little bit more to what we're trying to get to.
I think you're right. Good. Okay, I'm gonna scroll, but I can always scroll back. All right. The district shall provide resources, training, and oversight necessary so that district level equity audits are completed biannually. School and district leaders shall be trained to conduct audits within their buildings biannually to gather data for cycles of improvement.
Is this a how?
It is a bit prescribed. Yeah.
Yeah, the last sentence is,
So the what is then that, so what we're looking for here is that audits are done.
Mhm.
So is it as simple as that?
And here,
Or conduct or?
I think that first sentence is appropriate. The district shall provide resources, training, and oversight necessary so the district level necessary for district equity audits. But we're starting to get into more of the prescription of how it's going to be done. And I guess I'm just trying to understand, why is it so specific?
Kim, do you recall? I don't remember.
I think it was based on work that Malika had looked at from other districts nationally. So when we looked at equity policies from other districts, we pulled some of their bullet points in and altered them. So this one may have been pulled without us really delving into it.
We talked about completing an audit every year. And I cautioned about having a large audit yearly because it doesn't give opportunity for really answering what was found in the audit. And that's where we got biennially from. And then the suggestion, and it can be taken out because it is, Dr. Broby, to your point, a part of the how that the smaller audits happen in buildings. So maybe just that first part of the sentence that it happens. And I do.
Would it be too much how to say so that district and building equity audits are completed, period?
Like that?
Yeah.
And then period, then you could take out the rest of it. Does that seem more of a what? Dr. Roby?
Yes, it does. And then even within, I know that we have administrative guidelines. If we are pairing, once this is completed, once we pair this with the administrative guidelines, then the what kind of and the details of any of these things can be kind of our guidebook as to how we're going to do that.
And I don't know, the conversation that took place, but in terms of how it was done in the past, was it, if it was annually or biannually, was it enough to catch what was needed in order to tweak the changes appropriately, or in time enough to really look at it, make the change, and begin to implement it? As you're alluding to, Dr. Roby, where your team looks at it and begins to say, how is it going to look like within the breadth of our district?
Yes. So every policy, there should be some sort of administrative guidelines that are connected to it. And so the details, so to your point, the board is more concerned about kind of the overview of what has taken place. And we do the how, the details, and report it out on whatever those appropriate timeframes, annually, biannually, quarterly, whatever, so that we're measuring against what the policy is. But I don't know that that should be included in the policy.
So this comes out, right? Are we in this too? So is that it then? The district shall provide resources, training, and oversight necessary so that district and building level equity audits are completed. Is that good?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Moving on. Last one. Good work, everybody. The board shall create and maintain an equity review checklist that will be utilized to determine if programs being developed and enacted, services and products being purchased, policies being adopted, and resources being allocated are done so in an equitable manner.
This to me seems a lot like what we just talked about, kind of a how. And actually both of them seem like it's in the first bullet. But I don't know. So this is basically saying that the way we're going to implement this policy is by creating a review checklist, and the board will do that.
Isn't this, to your point, Dr. Baker, isn't this what this whole thing is? I mean,
right. And we're kind of expecting, well, we're not kind of, we are expecting the superintendent and her staff to implement and verify this work.
We had a lot of discussion about this at the policy committee level about the equity checklist. Where does it belong? Is it a rule? Is it part of the policy? So I can appreciate the wondering about it. I'm not sure we're there quite yet.
and the purpose of the checklist, because again, you have policy. So the checklist to me is more kind of a function of, yep, I did this, I did this, I did this, versus seeing evidence of the work that's really impacting the overall intent of the policy.
Kim, will you help a little bit with the equity checklist conversation, Kim Davis?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So it is confusing when we're thinking about what and how. And I think the last thing we talked about as a committee was when we're presented with something from administration to the board, is there some way that we can ensure that we are making this policy a working document? That it's something, is there some sort of checklist or something that we go through when we're presented with big decisions that we have to vote on? that
So
keeps our board in check.
So my push on that would be is that if you go back through the other itemized list, so when something is presented, whatever the topic is, we can say, okay, does this match kind of the intent going back to our policy versus having a checklist? I guess I'm not clear on the need for the checklist because that seems really, really specific.
Yeah. And I think that we'd end up leaving things out that were important, or it's just,
I mean, it is a breeding document. So let's say that there is a checklist. We're spending money, education materials, staff training, and so forth, are coming to the board and reported on and looking at. In terms of being holistic in some way, as a board, we're saying, okay, this looks holistic, whatever that means to us, or for this checklist, if you will, is helping us get at that. It's certainly fluid, may change in time, but it's not so much a do's and don'ts as much as are we covering the basics from the superintendent perspective, and then the board chiming back with whatever it can say in regards to that.
seems like this is complicated. I'm thinking of, from the finance committee, there were, when I don't know if we still do that, but there was the,
I just see if we needed anything from the grocery store still.
Kathy, can you mute?
I think someone else should be able to mute her as well. Yep. Thanks.
Yeah. I could use some milk. So.
I think, I know there are districts that have this sort of equity review checklist. I think the thinking behind it came out of the conference that we went to, the CUBE conference. And then what I have always thought of it, I've always referenced Dr. Baker when at Academic Achievement, when we created that checklist of sorts for our academies at Ottawa Hills.
Right.
And I don't know that it's necessary. I just wonder, I think because we want this equity policy to be such a big part of our work.
Yeah.
I just wonder if that would make it live and breathe a little bit more than some policy, sometimes policies, they're just so wordy. Would we really go back and look at every bullet point when we're presented with big decisions? So I think that's the thinking behind it.
Well, I'm also just thinking about how do we do it? I'd hate for somebody like Dr. Roby to, at the end of the year, be scrambling to fill out this checklist. Mm-hmm. But I think of like a budget. If we're going to spend money monthly, and this may or may not be possible, but perhaps the finance committee, in working with the superintendent and the CFO, create a way to account for these equitable policies on a monthly basis. So there used to be, and I don't know if there still is, like a local first type policy.
Still is. Yep.
Okay, with there's like a 5% advantage, and then there's a report on that when people are hired. I just wonder if that would be something done, or like the academic committee would ask questions reviewing the equity of curriculum, and then I'm just trying to think of something that would be actually.
And I think that how it got put in the policy was the discussion in policy committee was, Sharon was asking, is this something you want for the board, not for the district, the board. So it's not the responsibility of the district to come up with this. It would be us as a team coming up with well, what are the questions we want to ask when we're presented with, you know, what are the things we want to make sure we know before we vote on something? Kind of thing.
I think it kind of, I mean, we went to this particular paragraph when I brought up the issue of accountability and indicators, and I don't know how we determine that we've reached what we're looking to have reached if we don't have a way to measure. So I'm just slightly confused as to, now that we're here at the last paragraph, that we don't think that that's needed.
And so I'm not saying it's needed. I'm just trying to understand the value of a checklist. So you have your policy, and again, you're trying to stay broad. It's our job to do the how, to say, this is what we're doing, and then to bring back information either anecdotally or very specifically. You know, we are doing this type of program at XYZ school, and here's how we've included our families. We held a parent meeting, we did surveys, we did this. So then you can go back to the policy to say, okay, yep, this is how voice has been included, and this is where it is. But when you have a checklist, what is the metric behind it? And that's where my push is. So you have a checklist, if something's presented and you're like, well, it needs to be 70% or it needs to be 92% or whatever. And I guess I'm trying to understand, it changes the focus of the board staying broad around their expectations around our equity work versus getting into the specifics of, well, we want you to do it exactly this way.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think, I personally don't have expectations of having you do it a certain way, but I'd like to see, for instance, as an indicator, I'd like to see that there is equity showing up in our enrollment, such as the plan that we've done with our theme schools. I'd like to see that in our access to advanced courses. Do you know what I mean? Versus we just have it out there and it's like, oh, well, you know, do it however you want to get it done without an ideal of what are our expectations, like where do we want to see. And I mean, of course we want it everywhere, but at the same time we know that there are certain areas in particular that are having systemic issues in our district, and we can identify those.
Yep, and I don't disagree with that. I think it is important to kind of say, this is where we are, here are goals around this, here's how we've included different voice, this is what we've done to kind of gather that. And forgive me for being kind of so persnickety on the word checklist, because I'm like, I guess I don't understand what's going to be done with it. And how is the board going to kind of, because for everything that's presented to this group, you'll have to have very specific, everything is not going to fit under just a generic checklist. And that's where I guess I'm trying to help kind of guide this conversation around what is it that you're looking for. So even as I or the team bring things forward, it's going to look different from enrollment. It's going to look different from business opportunities from different corporations and companies. It's going to look different from academic. It's everything, it'll have its own measures. And so each time, are you going to be creating something different? And I don't want to put you all in kind of this tunnel where you can't really measure it, or you're always creating these different rubrics, versus using this policy, which is the guide, to kind of say, okay, and to say, based on what we're seeing on this particular presentation with finance, this is what it looks like. And then to kind of go back up to the policy, and Ms. Shaki, if you can kind of scroll up to some of those statements. Mm-hmm. Have we met that measure, the intent behind it, versus having a checklist? And I know, you know, both, and please, those who worked on the committee, please weigh in if I'm understanding this incorrectly.
No, I think this has always been a little bit confusing.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just saying that it's always been a little bit confusing. What it really is the way that I always pictured it was like questions. So, and to your point, Dr. Roby, the bullet points in our policy really are what those questions would be.
Right.
Like when it comes to the one on community voice. So the question I would ask, or we would ask as a board, would be, whose voice isn't included in what you're presenting right now? So I've always pictured it more of like a list of 10 questions that we as a board want to ask whenever we're presented with something, which really, like you were saying, it really does mirror the bullet points.
Yeah, I was holding back too, and I was going to suggest that that everything that is within this bullet point, it really is reflected in all of the other bullet points. And if we approach it in that sense, I mean, it's kind of redundant. And I don't think we need it. I think that if we measure our actions or the actions of the district against our policy with those bullet points included, then that's kind of our checklist. It's right in front of us. So I agree with you.
Ms. Pitts, do you remember what you were going to say?
Yeah, I think I was going to say that when the administration brings something to the board, obviously we have this policy and we would go through all of the different bullets to make sure that we have addressed them. And then when we're presenting things to the board, we could certainly refer to those things. And that, you know, that would be the board's assurance that we have considered them, we have data, if the board needs the data or whatever, but that would be how the administration would actually present things to the board in this framework. And that, you know, and then if the board had additional questions, did you think about this or did you think about that? Then they could raise that, but they would have something already as a framework.
So I'm going to advocate that we take it off. It sounds like we've got most of it covered, if not all of it, in the policy. But that if we find that once we've voted on the policy and it's enacted, that we don't find it to be the tool that we need to accurately evaluate what's coming to us, that then at a new work session, we look at some of these equity checklists from the other districts and see if we'd like to create a guiding document for us as the Board of Education to help us look at decisions in front of us as it relates to our equity policy. Does that sound okay?
I support that.
I think we need to tackle it. I think whatever that defined checklist is or not, I think we need to tackle it and figure out what is it that we continue to look for again, because we're heading towards a 10-year plan as we're moving forward. And so doing the legwork now, and I don't know what that 1 through 10 or whatever it is ought to be, but I do think that we should wrestle with this and say what are we looking for? And as Ms. Pitt was alluding to, often when stuff is presented to the board and we do have questions, again in a timely manner, the information should be gotten back to us. And I think that rhythm, obviously, with this is going to get better. So with how the expectation of the board is being raised with issues or with things that the board is requiring or asking for. But I do think we should wrestle with what does this equity or expectation of a checklist.
But do benchmarks, Reverend Matthias, do benchmarks belong in a policy?
Yeah.
Right. I see two separate things, right? The strategic planning we're going to do is going to set the benchmarks and is going to say, this is what we expect to happen over the next couple of years, or the goals we're setting for the district to move toward. Whereas the equity checklist is just a guiding document to ensure that we are using the policy to make our decisions. So it's not clear, the checklist isn't going to say we are going to achieve X, Y, or Z from a metric standpoint. It's just a way for us to use the policy better, is my understanding.
What I wanted to, oh, I'm sorry, was somebody else talking?
Ms. Lewis, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, Ms. Lewis, go ahead.
No, I just started to say, we talked about the how, and this is the how, isn't it? I mean, you know, shall we be creating? Are we going to make the rubrics? Are we going to do all these things? We won't. It will have to be staff that does those kinds of things. So I think this is one of those questions, whether, you know, it's a how are we going to do it, or what does it mean? And what were the words, what and why?
Yeah. So I'm still going to advocate that we remove the bullet from the policy, because I think it is a tool that we'd like to create. I'm hearing that, and I'm willing to have that work be done at a future work session. But as far as this policy is concerned, I don't know that we want the equity checklist to be part of the policy.
Right, I agree.
Ms. Shaki, I wanted to also just remind us that we had a really good discussion in the committee about this not being one of the policies that just go in the book and no one ever sees again. And you all discussed even how to keep this alive, either by reading the policy statement at the beginning of meetings or other things like that. So I just wanted to bring that conversation forward as assurance that at least the committee was not thinking that this would just, you know, you all would just check this off and that would be it.
Yeah, thank you.
And we'll have to, I mean, this has to live with the board. I mean, the administration will get used to saying, well, how are we making these decisions about purchasing equitably? You know, does this curriculum reflect, you know, the needs of refugees? So.
And I like your idea, Ms. Shockey, about it being a tool. So maybe it doesn't need to be in the policy, but as a board, we could have the discussion of what those questions might be, and maybe even have a copy of it, you know, that we have with us at meetings, so that it doesn't just become a hidden policy that we don't have right in front of us all the time. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to.
So the public reading this, what would they get out of it? If a parent would be reading this, what would they get out of the bullet points that we have here?
Well, I'm not quite sure how to answer that question. I think they would see very clearly our commitment to making equitable decisions in the district, and our willingness to identify and remove barriers, and really our clear statement on how we feel about how we intend to run and support the district. But others chime in.
President Jackie.
Yeah, I think that's true. We are highlighting the work that we are willing to do to achieve to get to an equitable position, and we're also highlighting the areas where we want to see equity. So this is really laying out our work and kind of defining what that equity looks like to us.
President Shockey?
Yeah.
I think it's like we're creating a culture of equity, and these are the kinds of things that we're going to do to make sure that that culture of equity is a part of everything that we do.
But to Reverend Matias's point, I think that's up to us. I don't think it needs to be part of the policy, but I think it's up to us as a board. And I don't want to speak for everybody, but I think based on conversations we've had, that this is important to all of us. And so I would foresee our community, I I think they're going to start to see this in action at our meetings and, you know, in our schools. And I think that's our goal, right? I think if we start asking those important questions that we would put on a checklist of sorts, they're going to see that in our meetings. And when we're voting on important things, they'll see that we're going to take this policy seriously, and that it's going to be something that is referenced all the time, hopefully.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this is something that we could defend and be proud of. So if any one of us is cornered, you know, really we could say, hey, as hard as these issues are, given our society, we are working towards these pieces, and we're committed to this. And as it evolves and it works itself out, we certainly respond. But it's a living, breathing document that I would feel good in defending and saying, hey, this is why this is needed and why we're working at this, even if I'm not 100% agreement with all the our constituents and stuff like that. But I do think we can say that, and you're right, it will be reflected in the work that we do, and hopefully the students that we produce that go out there in the workplace and so forth.
Okay, so I'm going to take away this last piece. The final sentence there is that the superintendent shall provide the board with an annual report detailing progress on the items listed in the policy. And so that really wraps it back up to how are we measuring, how are we going to hear about the progress that's being made. This last sentence really states that we'll receive an equity report on an annual basis to help us understand how what we've set forth in this policy is being put into action. All right. Any other comments? Remember, the goal now is to move this forward to a first reading. So that will happen at an upcoming board meeting. And after the second reading, it will be an official policy. This is work to be
Can
proud
I
of.
ask just
Yeah.
a quick clarification question?
Yeah.
So and this is just more logistics, not about this particular policy, but just in general. Once a policy is approved for its final reading, does it go into action immediately, or does it go into action July 1 of the new year? Because I've seen it done in both ways, and I just want to make sure that I understand.
Immediate action, correct, Ms. Pitts? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, immediately.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
All right.
Dr. Roby, we have an effective date at the bottom of the policy, and so the effective date will be the date that the board actually approves it for final reading.
That's when the policy goes into effect, but it's not necessarily that the practices are immediately determined.
Well,
Yeah,
we
the
typically try
ongoing,
to.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
we typically try to begin to implement the policy.
So get on it.
Yeah, you don't have much time, Sharon.
Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen here. All right, so Ms. Pitts, I will get these edits to you, and then I'm also going to have Ms. Lewis clean up my grammar, which she is so good at.
Commas. Commas.
Yes, I've always been an over comma user, unfortunately. Can't break that habit. Okay, wonderful. Well, I'm proud of all of you. Thank you for contributing to that document. So important that we did that work together. So well done. Okay, does anybody need a couple-minute break before we move on to strategic planning? Are you ready to go? A few minutes? Good, okay. All right.
Just reviewing RFP, not strategic planning.
I'm sorry, excuse me, yes. Yeah. Bring the RFP, don't worry. Okay, we'll keep moving on. If you need a break, feel free to turn your screen off and take a minute. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Baker and Mr. Helmholt to walk us through the draft strategic planning RFP. And thank you, Dr. Baker, for your leadership in this work. Really appreciate you bringing this draft to us. So take it away.
Well, it was the subcommittee that you put together that did this work, and so this also went through writing by committee already. So it's been wordsmith as well. So there's not a lot to. So I'm hoping that there's not a lot to change, but we do need. So I have the document. Should I try to just share my screen, or is John Helmholt able to share his?
I can share it too if you want, Dr. Baker.
Yeah, sure. Why don't we, if you want to, I got it ready to go. Let's see. Actually, I don't have it ready to go.
Do we need, Dr. Baker, would you like us to bring John into the meeting? I don't think that he's actually in right now.
He's here.
Oh, he is?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yep.
Missed
I'm
you.
here.
Sorry.
Yep.
Sorry.
If you want to give me just a second, I can pull it up.
Yeah, why don't you pull it up, because then you can make changes and get it out tomorrow morning right away too. So I have, well, we can talk about it as go through. I'll probably want to go through more quickly than others, but a lot of this I'll just kind of reference is kind of standard. It's the first page or so is material that we've already written because it's material that came from our superintendent search and our other public input sessions that describe the district and the city. And then I have a list of questions that do, I think, require consensus or perhaps unanimity. So we'll wait till John gets it out. I also want to illustrate that these are, this is different than hiring a superintendent. So, so there are kind of set firms out there that do this kind of work. And so this fits the language that's been used. And John was great at finding lots of examples. So the committee had 4 or 5 examples of similar RFPs. So it reflects that input. It also reflects input from the superintendent and the committee members to try to determine what an appropriate timeline was, et cetera. So anyway, if John is ready to go.
Can everyone see the screen?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay.
But yeah, just go through the district background and the
sure.
So this is
sure.
all standard. This would be stuff that we would have used to explain the district and then the city in the next paragraph, and other kinds of documents that we put out.
Yeah, and I would just note that this is pretty template. I mean, this is very much part of the traditional format for RFPs. So we have the little background on the district. You've got some background on the city of Grand Rapids. And then we get into the purpose of the strategic planning that outlines the 8-year strategic plan expectation.
So that's where I want
equity.
So that's where I want you to stop. So the scope. So the committee. So there's the boilerplate or our template stuff that's above, but then there's a scope of the work, and this is where the committee spent a lot of time. We decided that 8-year was the time frame we wanted to consider for this, and other districts do 5 years or 10 years. We chose 8 because it mimics the transformation plan, which was implemented in 2012 and now 2020. So we're beginning this implementation process with the expectation that in 2030, there'll be a new group of board members who will be determining what that strategic plan looks like. So I want to make sure that everybody's okay with this time frame, because that is something that we have to commit to.
Dr. Baker, later in the document, will you or John unpack that, even though similar to what we just had this discussion about with our equity policy, that it's this transformation or strategic plan really is a living, breathing document. And even though it'll be enacted sometime in 2021 or 2022, there has to be kind of checkpoints and pulse points of what that looks like. So we're not saying, okay, we're predicting what's going to happen in 2030.
Well, no, I don't think that is in this document. However, I do think that we should expect that to be something that the strategic plan includes once it's implemented. And I think that just so you know, I think that we'll vote on it on December 20th. So you'll have to implement on the 21st since you guys do it so immediately. So anyway, so get it all ready. So anyway, yeah, so let's, what we should do is that when we have the scope of the work as we're asking of the firms, that this timeline or this implementation strategy, we should make sure that this document says that. So anything more on that, the 8 years? Okay, John, you want to continue on?
Yep. So here's the scope of work. I just want to emphasize real quick under the purpose here, there are kind of two key priorities, and one is that equity must be at the center of all decisions in every aspect of the strategic plan, and that a priority focus is put on the expectation for comprehensive, inclusive, transparent, internal, external stakeholder engagement. And you'll see the scope of the work really gets into that, talks about the prioritizing an authentic, inclusive, transparent, comprehensive process. Talks about the core areas of focus, and this is a little bit different. This has been updated to include a few items that were not in the first draft, and that's specifically around parent and family engagement, and then climate, culture, safety, and then athletics and extracurricular activities.
It's pretty comprehensive. If anybody thinks something is missing, I do want to say that it leads with equity and inclusion. I think that the fact that those paragraphs were written before this equity policy is voted on does kind of illustrate the way that we'll do this effectively if we do equity work. Is that just an expectation from the administration that this is important and us looking for it? So I want to thank John for putting that in there at the beginning, and then of course the committee members who emphasizes especially the inclusion of stakeholders.
You'll see it also includes the scope of the work is putting emphasis on exemplar models of other mid-sized to larger urban public school systems, looking at a proposal that will look at more efficient, effective, and sustainable use of resources, facilities, and other district assets. The scope should incorporate a review and analysis of the transformation plan, the equity enrollment audit, plant morans per pupil or pupil enrollment projection study, the facilities assessment utilization, district response plan for significant disproportionality, the Office of Civil Rights report, and the GRPS academic curriculum and technology plans.
What I think is important about that paragraph is that there is an expectation that the firm that we hire understands the work that precedes it, and doesn't just start from scratch, and that we've done a lot of work, and that we want it to be offered to them as a tool and benchmark.
And then, of course, it kind of concludes scope that the Grand Rapids Board of Education shall be actively involved and engaged throughout the entire process. And a lot of that language was right from the board survey, where members of the board were asked kind of what they want to see with strategic planning. So we incorporated that language from those responses throughout this proposal. Then it gets into the contents of the proposal. And this is so that there's some degree of uniformity amongst the proposals. So we specify expectations around a submittal letter, the description of the firm, organizational structure, references and description of experience, and then of course the project overview and costs. You've got the deliverables, as well as a project schedule.
John, can you go back up to the deliverables?
Yep. Deliverables are needs assessment, the methodology and dissemination, the comprehensive internal external stakeholder engagement, analysis and assessment of that stakeholder input, the preliminary report and recommendations, and then of course the final report and the 8-year vision and strategic plan.
Dr. Roby, does that get at kind of what you think might be needed, or should we be more, does the 8-year vision kind of include kind of an implementation schedule?
It should, and maybe we need to spell that out, that it has to have an implementation schedule, and then also the flexibility, because what makes me just a little nervous is we're trying to be predictive of, 2021, what we're going to need in 2029. And so that's where I want to have, and of course, to make our strategic plan or our transformation plan or whatever we decide to call it a living document, we want to make sure that we have some flexibility of, we don't know what's going to happen in 2027 or 2023 or whatever, and that we're adaptable to, we're going to constantly be reviewing what we initially said and how we planned, and then where we can adjust, similar to as we just had that conversation around our equity policy, that we wanted it to be malleable to current conditions and time.
I'd like to interject here. I don't know if it's appropriate time in terms of how your presentation is going, Dr. Baker, but
go ahead.
But the 8-year, I know that you've had a committee look at this and whatnot, but it just does seem like a long stretch. And I know that normally these are done in 3 to 5 year strategic plans that I'm more familiar with and have reviewed. And I have not reviewed this, and so I'll make that clear that I would want to hear some justification for an 8-year plan.
Other committee members, I think to some extent I can say the transformation plan probably was, I think that we could say that the last couple, 2 to 3 years, has been less of a guiding post. We've recognized that things need to be changed. So with that said, I think that 5-year plans might make more sense. But I also just wonder about how long it takes to stop and start. But 5 years, if our plan included preparing for the next strategic plan in year 5, so that way we're not kind of wandering for a couple of years before we a new one. I think a 5-year plan is appropriate. And also, since presumably, I don't know what other people are planning on doing in 2030, but I'm pretty sure I won't be on the board, and we are making decisions for people that won't be here. Whereas in 5 years, at least, I would hope that 4, 5, or 6 of us are still there. So I think that makes sense.
What about a range?
Probably more realistic too.
Or even to progress, to measure it as an educator, you always have progress monitoring. So you have kind of your plan, but then you have some very specific stop points to say, okay, this is what we said in 2021. Now we're in 2023.
Mm-hmm.
What has changed? What are the conditions? And to give ourselves that flexibility that we're not locked into. And I know that, we wouldn't be, but that we don't lock ourselves into something that we have no idea what's coming.
I like the idea of progress monitoring and maybe them providing a schedule for that. And my other wonder is it unheard of for companies to provide what ideally they suggest our time frame would be based on the information they gather in the next 6 months? So speaking to President Schottky, I heard her just chime in, like, could we give a range, 5 to 8 year or something like that?
Having gone through, I think a majority of the transformation plan, lots of lots of curveballs and lots of things that took place that had to be prepared in terms of ask for monies from the public and just different things that were part of planning for those things. And so, you know, an 8-year plan doesn't seem very long once you get into it. But I agree. I think a range would be helpful, and the progress monitoring would allow us to really tweak. One of the questions I had was in regards to, and perhaps we're assuming that population growth and those kinds of things will be part of what they provide us for and with, as we're looking at school-aged children and those kinds of things, what our communities will be looking like. But it's going to go fast.
Yeah.
I'm a little concerned about how much has changed just in this past year in delivering educational services, and what the future is going to look like here in the next 3 to 5. And I just I don't know. I see a whole changed environment here, and to be locked into this, you know, like we were somewhat locked into that transformational plan. I think we need greater flexibility. And I don't know if it's a 2-year review or a 3-year review or a 5-year review to look at our plan and make appropriate adjustments, but we need to build that in. And I think certainly, again, I'll say that 8 years is certainly too long.
Well, at one level, we would always, any future board or superintendent could always have the discretion to change course or to not build a building or whatever. I think a range 5 to 8 years, and they're going to have, it has to be flexible. I'm glad that we're starting this now instead of a year and a half ago and have it done right before COVID hits, because then it would be completely. So I agree that with Jose that could be, but I also think that I think John's right. If this involves a bond proposal and, you know, we ask for the bond in 22, it doesn't get implemented until 24, 25, or 26 by the time we get around to building. We need it to still be, but if a 5-year plan, this won't be done until the end of this year. A 5-year plan wouldn't start until 22. So we're still talking 27. I don't know. And you know what? I think that these firms will know better than us what's realistic in terms of a range of years, how many years it takes before their plans become out of date.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with you. I agree with you, Dr. Baker, that any firm that's facilitating this will be able to kind of share, especially as they've worked with mid-size and large urban districts, to kind of say, here's what districts have done, and this is where they've tweaked, and this is how they, you know, made their plans really those living documents, because we're trying to, a lot of ways, be very visionary and predictive, and it's harder, you know, as you go further out, it's harder to kind of predict what is going to be taking place. And your example around COVID is a perfect example. A year ago, we were not, the way in which we view school now versus how we did a year ago at this time looks completely different. And we need to be, our plan needs to be flexible and adaptable to our current situation. We want to be forward thinking and visionary, but we also want to have the space to give ourselves permission to adjust in our current climate or things that may come that we have no idea are on the horizon.
So how about for this, we put final report with implementation schedule and 5 to 8 year vision / plan.
Yeah, I was gonna say we could include in the deliverables that they need to provide a plan for that allows for flexibility and progress monitoring.
Okay.
But that could be tagged along with what you just said, Dr. Baker.
John, you got enough to just change the language to make it look.
Yep.
Okay. I think that you know what we like and can wordsmith it. and
Yep,
send it out.
I've identified a few other places in the document that will need to be updated where we reference the 8-year plan.
Okay. All right. The schedule is the next thing to make sure. If you could pull up the full schedule on one screen, John, if it's possible. I don't think you can. Actually, you can get up to February 9 because that's where we're at now. So the RFP would go out tomorrow and it would go into the places. John, you want to talk about how you're how we typically get out these RFPs and where it goes to?
Yep. So we will be issuing a press release. We will be posting it to the different sites through MASB, MASA, the KISD. We've also connected with the GREA, Talent 2025, XQ. Just a reminder, the XQ Super School Institute, that was the group that did the $100 million award for reinventing high schools. That was for the museum school. GVSU, as well as Ed Trust Midwest, and some past consultants, specifically Richard Lemons, who's done a lot of work with the district, National Equity Project. So we're going to be sharing through those various channels. We also asked for suggestions of school districts that are kind of similar size, urban, or model examples of success stories. And so we have a pretty comprehensive list that includes, I'm reaching out or have already reached out to these districts asking about who did their strategic planning. And so we'll target those as well. And it ranges from Denver Public to Aldine Public Schools in Texas, Hartford Public Schools, Ann Arbor, Dearborn, Syracuse, Norwalk, Alexandria, Indianapolis, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Tulsa, San Antonio, Baltimore, Valley View in Illinois, and there's a couple others on there as well. And so in addition to kind of casting a wide, broad net, we're also going to be targeting those school districts and asking for input from them. If we, or in some cases we already have, where we will then reach out specifically to those strategic planning consultants that they worked with.
So it's pretty exhaustive. So thanks for that. It's a lot of work. So we would be, just to go through this, we would be receiving these proposals by March 5th. At the end of that workday, these proposals would be sent to the board. We would have and only have the weekend to review these the written proposals. On March 8th, with a board work session, we would choose which firms we wanted to interview. Presumably 3-ish. So, and then March 15th, we'd have a board work session prior to the regular meeting, which means that we would finish these interviews in the 2-hour time frame between 4:30 and 6:30 for our regular meeting. And then on March 26th, we would meet the people that we hired, and they would work with us on going through this strategic planning. And then that we could also ask some of these questions that we've been discussing today.
Dr. Baker, that work session has been moved to April, so the date just needs to be updated. John, to April 16.
Yeah, sorry.
April, that's, you know, I just noticed that. So April 16th.
Yep.
And then the rest of the schedule up until we get to, I guess, presentation of the draft and the revised draft would be presumably the firm would be doing that work. But they would provide us a schedule that would be more specific. with a hope that we would adopt this plan in December. Any other questions about the schedule? Okay. I don't know if we need to do anything else. I guess these are just criteria we should keep in mind. We did discuss whether or not we wanted to have some sort of a, not necessarily
Rubric.
a rubric, yeah, some sort of a rubric that wasn't points based, but just would allow us to do, and we could actually, even these criteria, we could just put into a document for us to keep in mind as we take notes over that weekend. Is everybody okay with that being our rubric? Okay.
And then the rest of this is just the general instructions. Where to submit it.
All right.
And we did discuss that the board will get electronic copies, correct?
Correct.
John, this is a minor technicality, but you may want to put a deadline on the RFIs, the request for information, so you're not answering questions up to the last minute, the day it's due.
Okay.
A suggestion.
But if somebody calls you that morning and still submits a proposal, could you take note of that and let us know? Because we probably wouldn't want to hire them. So,
Yeah, Dr. Baker, I think as we talked about like a point system or something, it was just not wanting to just base it on, a score of XYZ gets you, but for it to be more fluid conversation, right?
yeah, it's just so we can kind of organize our thoughts as what's important, rather than just I like this one or I didn't like it. We can kind of think through: is their timeline appropriate? Is there past work similar to what we want, et cetera? So.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Baker. We, I guess, need to vote on the approval of the RFP. So there's, of course, been some suggested edits that Mr. Helmholtz going to incorporate into the document. But at this point, I will entertain a motion for approval of the strategic planning RFP with those edits included.
Motion to approve the RFP.
Second.
Okay, any further discussion? All right, Ms. Lewis, you can call the roll. Ms. Lewis, you're on mute.
Thank you. Dr. Flores,
Yes.
Ms. Grant,
Yes.
Ms. Lewis, yes. Reverend Matias,
Yes.
Mr. Ross is absent. Mrs. Williams,
Yes.
Dr. Baker,
Yes.
Ms. Davis,
Yes.
Ms. Shockey,
Yes.
motion carries.
Excellent. All right, well, thank you, Mr. Helmholtz, for your work on developing the RFP. Thank you, Dr. Baker, and the ad hoc committee for